Welcome to Decoded, the podcast that decodes the design, technology, and experiences shaping our world and planet. I am Elisa Leñero.
And I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen. Together we explore the systems, behaviors, and technologies influencing how we live, work, and connect, from human interactions to the ecosystems we are part of.
Each episode is a conversation with technologists, designers, entrepreneurs, and everyday users. Join us. Welcome back to the show. My name is Melissa and I'm a designer by training and currently rediscovering what design is in times where the world is challenged in many different ways, from artificial intelligence revolution to the deep societal changes and the massive ecosystem destruction.
And I'm Saima. I'm a professor of design engineering and innovation and director of DigitLab, exploring design and digital technologies based in the University of Exeter. And in today's episode, we'll be exploring some big themes around social entrepreneurship and poverty with our first Lord on the show, Lord John Bird. So welcome, Johnny.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking me.
No, that's fantastic that you're here. And John Bird, or Lord John Baron Bird, is a British social entrepreneur and anti-poverty campaigner, best known for co-founding The Big Issue in 1991 with Gordon Roderick. Through The Big Issue, he created opportunities for homeless people to earn an income by selling magazines. And in recognition of his work, he received an MBA in 1995 and became a member of the House of Lords in 2015. Today, he continues to campaign for solutions to poverty, homelessness, and social inequality.
Oh, I agree with everything you said about me, but I haven't got an MBA because I haven't been for a Master's of Business, whatever, upholstery. I've got an MBE, which is something that the Queen gives out, or now the King.
Well, thank you. I think you've just upgraded from an MBA. Right, so you've done some really, really big things. I think many of us can't even dream of getting anywhere close to what you've done. But if we start with what you're most well known for, which is The Big Issue, and you started with that over 35 years ago. So in design, we talk about wicked problems. So these are problems that don't have very clear answers. They're a bit knotty and they're wicked. And you can change one part, but have a major impact on another part. If we're thinking about a way to provide income for homelessness, that really is a wicked problem, requiring rethinking about many challenges that are faced by homelessness people, not just income, but thinking about dignity, for example, of those people who are experiencing homelessness. Can we talk through some of the challenges you had to navigate when you started Big Issue? And how did you take this really big problem and come up with a solution that actually is still there and going 35 years later?
Well, probably there were two lots of people who stood in the way of us starting The Big Issue and starting a means of giving the homeless an honest way of making money, so that if they were with drink problems or drug problems or gambling problems, they didn't have to rob people in order to feed their habits. So I was wanting to give them the same opportunity that if you work in the City of London, for instance, and you want a stimulation in the evening and you want to have a bit of cocaine or whatever, I don't know, then, if you work in the City of London, you don't have to rob anybody for that. You just ring up your dealer. And what I wanted to do was decriminalize the homeless because they had loads of problems on the streets. If they weren't drug users or drinkers before they started the streets, if they started this living on the streets, they very quickly became users because it was a coping mechanism. It was a way of blotting out your mind. So I wanted to give people the chance of making their money legitimately and decriminalize them, so then I could help them move on and get work or get housing and all that. The big problem we ran into was the homeless, because all they wanted to do was just receive money
Mm.
And their minds were so screwed over that they were very self-harming and couldn't perceive of a life beyond the streets. And this was people who'd only been on the streets maybe 6 months or a year, some people 10, 20 years. So we had to overcome the thinking. We had to redesign the thinking of the homeless. But then the other big thing was the homeless organizations. There were 501 homeless organizations in London alone when we started the big issue in 1991. And those, with very few exceptions, hated the idea of me, a person who had been homeless, a person who had been a street liver and had been in and out of prison. They hated the idea that I was going to start a project, because what they said was, you can't help the homeless, really. You've got to get them into hostels. You've got to get them sitting in the corner behaving themselves. You've got to be, you are the doctor and they are the patient. And I was saying, no, 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 no. What we've got to do is help them grow up, help them face the problems that that had led them to the streets. So virtually all of the homeless organizations turned against me, and I had to fight them. And I fought them in a very, very simple way. They called a meeting to tell me off and to say, who are you, John Bird, etc. You've never worked for Crisis, you've never worked for Shelter. And they're all like that. And I played the class card, which you have to use every now and then. I said in a very soft voice, I said, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it really be nice? Wouldn't it be really, really nice if someone who had had the problem of homelessness, had been homeless, had come out of prison, had done all sorts of things, had been a rough sleeper, wouldn't it be nice if you backed them? And they completely shut up and left me alone. Because what I was doing was I was raising something which 35 years ago people didn't talk about, and that was lived experience. And that shut them all up. And therefore, I could carry on, and I didn't have people squabbling and saying things to the media behind my back. So I had a very, very good relationship with them. And it was a relationship of, you keep away from me and I'll keep away from you. I was trying to do something different. I was trying to say that if you take a homeless person and redesign them, because I'm very interested in that concept, you redesign their thinking. That meant you got them thinking as though that one day they would be able to move away from the streets. One day they could be aspirational. And even the people, and there were many of them, who would die on the streets because they had had so much harm done against them as children, and they had done so much harm against themselves, that they were never going to get off the drink or the drugs. And all you could do was make them safe. Even those people, we could get them into a situation, get them off the streets, get them into housing, get them into rooms and support them and be their family, be
Right.
the hand holder. And that was a great, it was a great privilege and a great sense of dignity that we could bring to people who had largely been looked upon as outsiders and socially excluded.
Yeah, that's the dignity part. This dignity part. It's something that resonates with me, and I feel so honored that you are here, especially since the topic of poverty is so close to my heart. I work for an organization that we work for around the world, powering entrepreneurs to end poverty. So we work in areas that are just above poverty line. And exactly, I think that you are a designer by heart. Talking about in 1991, designing something, as Saima said, like a wicked problem that was not addressed in the way that, as you put it in your words, it's something that you struggle with as well. So co-designing that solution with coming from experience. Can I ask you, why a magazine? How the idea come to you as this should be through a magazine, and this should part of the, I want to understand more like the thinking behind the product and how you thought through the process in which then the homeless would get part of the funding.
Well, I think if you're going to be a good designer, you have to be a good thief as well. Uh, so we were good thieves. Gordon Roddick, who Simon mentioned earlier, who gave me the money to start the big issue, was the founder with his wife of the Body Shop, Anita Roddick, Gordon Roddick, and they'd founded an enormously important business in the 70s, which did things like campaign against slave labor, against FGM, and all those sorts of things, campaigned against animal testing. And Gordon Roddick was in New York in 1990 because they had a couple of hundred shops over there. And some guy approached him selling a street paper called Street News. So, and the guy came up to him. He was a very large guy. He said he was like a wardrobe. And he approached him. And Gordon was quite worried because this guy was much bigger than him. And the guy said, "Sir, would you like to buy a copy of my street paper?" And Gordon said, "Yeah, how much is it?" He said, "It's $1." He said, "How does it work for you?" He said, "I buy it for 50 cents. I sell it for $1. Why do you do it?" And he fell into conversation. And this guy said, "Well, I come from Brownsville, which is a place where, Mike Tyson comes from. It's a place of great poverty, and a lot of people coming from there end up in the penitentiary." And he said, "I spent most of my life in the penitentiary. I'm 54. I've got 2 children. I want to look after those children. I want to get them educated. And I don't want to go back in the penitentiary. And then I see the street paper. I make 50%. So I buy it for 50 cents. I sell it for £1, for $1. That is an immediate hit for me. I've got a room in Queens. I'm sorting myself out. I'm sending money to my wife, and Gordon said, "Wow," because in London at that time there were in the region of about 6,000 homeless people sleeping in the centre of London. People talk about how bad homelessness is now. It was a lot worse then. And Gordon saw, well, why don't we do this? So he came back and got the Body Shop Foundation to do a feasibility study, and they couldn't get any of the homeless groups to look at a way of creating a street paper. And the reason for that was that they all said, well, homelessness is a very complex problem, and if you give homeless people money, they'll only spend it by pouring it down their throat or putting it in their arm or up their nose or whatever. And so therefore we shouldn't be doing it. So Gordon came to me. I'd met Gordon when I was hiding from the police as a 21-year-old. So this was like 20 years later, 22 or 3 years later. And I'd met him and we became friends. I didn't see him for 20 years. And he came to me because I'd been homeless. I had no sentimental attachment to the poor. I wasn't going to cry over the poor. There's too many people in the world crying over them, but not bringing change in their lives. And also, I believe very strongly that you had to decriminalize them. So one of the problems we ran into, I'm sorry, I might not be answering your question. I'm very known for not answering questions.
You're getting there. You're getting there.
Yeah. One of the real interesting things was that the homeless organizations didn't want to give money to homeless people because they would misuse it. But I said to them, hang on, what are they doing at the moment? How are they feeding their habits? They're committing crime. They're prostituting their bodies. Girls and boys are selling their bodies to make money. Boys and girls, young people are going into shops and shoplifting. They're mugging people at the ATM. They're breaking into cars. They're doing all sorts of things. Wouldn't it be better if they didn't have to do that? So that was really the thinking. And one of the things I really was interested in was the dignity of everyone. And this might be my Catholicism, it might be whatever, I don't know. I believe in the dignity of everyone. And I think if you clean people up, you give them an opportunity, you begin to believe in them, then in a sense, they try and, or they stumble towards believing in themselves, which means that they start to make a transformation. So this was, to me, was how do you redesign the streets, and how do you redesign people in the streets, and how do you redesign governments and people to get people out of the streets. Now, we started on the double yellow lines at the West End of London, and we spread to all over the UK. We then went to France, we went to Holland, we went to Poland, we went to Russia, we went to Italy, we went to Kenya, we went to Namibia, and we went to South Africa. We went far to the Far East, to Tokyo and South Korea. We went to North America and South America, all based on an idea that we stole from America.
Yeah.
The
But you're
thing
able to
about
scale it, right? So
sorry,
you were able to scale it to other contexts.
well, we did. We worked on the principle, a very, very sensible principle, which is that you meet people from these countries. They come to see you, or you go to see them. And you find local providers. You don't, I mean, what I've noticed in the work that we've done in Africa and in other parts of the world, if you meet the right local people, they'll do it for you. And what you'll do is you'll just give them the model, and they will interpret it, taking into account different local conditions. And so we created an international, universal movement. And we don't make money out of it. It's not like, creating new McDonald's. It's not capitalism. It's not even. No. It's. I don't. These people tell me what to do often. I don't tell them what to do.
Can I pick up on a theme you said? So you mentioned lived experience in there, and how you had two barriers. So one barrier was the organizations themselves, and you turned that around by showing your lived experience. The second was homeless people themselves. How did you bring them on board?
Well, I brought them on. I didn't bring them on board. You did, or your mother did, or your father, whoever 30 years ago was buying the big issue. You did it. The public.
And how did you convince homeless people to sell a big issue?
No, I didn't do it. What it was that 30 years ago, 35 years ago now, the public reluctantly bought the paper, and then they read the paper and they talked to the vendor, and then by a process of, what's that thing where everything spreads? What's it called? Viral. It went viral. Mm-hmm. Said, have you read the big issue? Have you? And it's about real issues. It's not just about fantasies and all sorts of things, or just distractions. Oh, have you spoken to that homeless person who's selling near Waterloo Bridge? He's had a phenomenal life, and he's so kind and thoughtful. When we met the homeless, they were disgruntled. They were angry. They were sometimes aggressive and violent towards us. We had to be violent to them when they were violent to us, so we had to stand up for ourselves. But the public made them, because the public started to include them as human beings, talk to them. Mm-hmm. You cannot talk to a beggar. If you talk to a beggar, and there were beggars on the streets from the days of the Roman Empire, if you talk to a beggar will always tell you how bad their lives is, how difficult it is to live. If you talk to a big issue vendor, most of them, I'm not saying all of them, most of them will say, oh yeah, I'm doing well, I'm getting myself cleaned up, and I'm going to getting my health sorted out, and I'm back with my family. So it was a plus, it wasn't a minus. And the public really bought into that. So the public all I had to do was produce the paper and convince a handful of vendors. And it was like 8 vendors. Look, you go out and sell the paper and you'll do well. And they went out and they sold the paper and they did well. And then other homeless people said, how comes you got £50 and you haven't been harassed by the police? How comes you're doing something, you're cleaning yourself up? How comes? And they say, oh, I've been selling the big issue.
Mm-hmm. Is that part of I love what you said about engaging with people, communicating with people, really understanding what's their experience. And for me, I want to understand also what is your perspective to a genuinely preventive anti-poverty strategy. Like you were tackling a problem that was already happening, right? Like homelessness was already happening. But if we talk about prevention, if we talk about one step behind that, what would be your strategy? I've been reading about the Ministry of Poverty Prevention that you wrote about, so that's why I'm asking you if you can unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I've just drawn a very silly little diagram, if you can see it. So what you've got is a very big circle.
Yep.
And either side is a very small circle.
Okay.
So
Right?
we just move that a little bit to the right, so we'll see the other. There we go. So we've got P and then C.
No, then you've got E in the middle.
Yep.
P is prevention. So that little circle, I'll explain it. What you've got, the way governments work, and most governments work this way, is they have a very, very small circle which represents prevention. So they do very little prevention because most of the money they spend is in the emergency. So 90% of all money spent in the world on social intervention is spent on emergency. So when the shit has hit the fan, that's when they get in. So they don't spend money on prevention of poverty, and nor do they spend much money on cure. Most of the money goes in the UK, in the United States, in Italy and various other countries, in Spain, France, and Germany. I mean, they're getting brighter. I mean, the Nordic countries are much better at spending money on prevention and money on cure. So they're trying to reduce the vast amount of money that they spent on emergency. The thing about emergency never gets you anywhere. All it does is you hold the hand of the poor. You make poverty a little bit more comfortable. So what we've got to do is we've got to move towards prevention and also towards cure. We need to make those little circles bigger, and we need to make the emergencies smaller. So in an ideal world, you'd probably have 3 circles, and all of them would be the same size. So you'd spend as much money on emergency as you would on cure, and you'd spend as much money on cure as you would on emergency and prevention. So this would be a logical way of a government to use its resources. And unfortunately, they and the public give loads of money to emergency. But if you put a big advertisement in the newspaper or made a little movie and put it on the media, and you said, what we're going to do is we're going to prevent people in 5 years' time ending up in refugees camps, ending up in dying from malnutrition. What we're going to do is we're going to put money into prevention. And that might mean in preventing wars, in preventing natural disasters, in preventing all sorts of things. And however you said that to the public, they'll say, no, we'll wait until the shit has hit the fan. And then we'll get very upset. And in my opinion, that is one of the major things that we need to redesign about human thinking. And that is why when I was asked by a group of students at the Royal College of Art, I was asked, John Bird, what would you redesign, the design students? I said, I'd redesign thinking.
Mm.
I'd redesign the public's thinking. I'd say to the public, wow, why don't we put our money, why don't we move the money from emergency by preventing the emergency? So the reason I ended up in the House of Lords in 2015. I applied for it. No one chose me. I went through a process, a bit like getting a job. So what I did was I applied. You can do that in the UK. You can become a member of the House of Lords if you're over 23, and hundreds of people apply. And they choose a couple every year, 2 or 3 a year. And they're called crossbenchers because they're not in any political party. And I applied because I realized that for all the hard work that I was doing and my team was doing to help people in homelessness to get out, and the other work that we were doing when we invented something called Big Issue Invest, which invests in schools and invests in hospitals and all sorts of things all over the UK. We invest in 500 different social businesses around the UK. I realized that all of this work that we were doing directly with homeless people, directly with people leaving the care, local authority care, or prisons, or the army, it was being compromised by government. And people were saying, Johnny Bird, you're so beautiful. You're a wonderful human being because you know how to think outside the box. And I said, yeah, but the only reason I'm thinking outside the box is the box isn't working. And the box is government. So I got into there, and I have had some remarkable limited successes, and I've managed to do things, and I've managed to push the government into realizing that it has to do more about prevention and it has to do more about cure. Give people the chance of support them in the emergency. You can't turn against the emergency. You cannot. I can't walk past people in the streets and say, I'm going to sort your problem out in 10 years' time. I have to respond. I have to talk to them. I have to give them money. I have to kind of say, look, I'm going to help you get the next meal. But you ought to come and work with the Big Issue or work with one of the other projects. But we can't turn our back against the emergency. That is our humanity.
Yeah.
That's where our humanity manifests itself at its finest. But we have to change the thinking so that human beings grow up. And I believe that we're due a really major, phenomenally major revolution in our thinking. We need a revolution. We don't need one that burns down buildings and beats people up because they're in the wrong class or the wrong religion or the wrong this. What we need is we need to revolutionize thinking in universities, in schools, and in colleges. And that is around how do we prevent these things happening?
And it's interesting you say that because in other areas, so for example, healthcare, which I think a couple of episodes ago, we had John Clarkson from the University of Cambridge talking about healthcare systems design. And one of the reports from Lord Aradasi, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, it's the NHS Future Plan for 10 years.
Yeah.
And that talks very firmly about prevention. It talks about prevention, digitalization, and shifting to the community. So the care coming through. Now, one of the challenges, having worked a little bit in that area, there is a lot of thinking on prevention, but it's around budgets as well, because the budgets and the money goes to the here and now, which is what you're calling emergency. And I guess in the case of healthcare, also probably a bit on cure, but not on prevention at the same time, because it requires a lot of investment. And I was wondering, how do you, when you describe me, you've had some small successes in there, or what is required to help implement that type of thinking?
Well, we have to stop training our doctors, and we have to stop training our teachers, and we have to stop training our university students in this kind of limited thinking, which is that, for instance, you just made the point that it's really expensive. Prevention is really expensive. Prevention is only expensive because the money's not there because it's all spent on emergency.
Yes, precisely.
So actually you have to re-budget. So for instance, I had a big argument with a young doctor who said to me that she was, I said, why did you become a doctor? She said, I want to help people when they're at most in need. And that's why I want to be a doctor. I said, well, you will always have a job because there's always people who are in need. I said, but I'm looking for the doctors who are going to prevent the illness happening in the first instance. And so I'm looking for new kind of doctors. I'm looking for doctors. I mean, I don't want to, I'm not using this as a political argument, but Uganda in the 60s, it paid Fidel Castro in Cuba. And this isn't a political point because I'm not politically aligned to Cuba or anybody, but they paid them to supply 5,000 what they call foot doctors, and these 5,000 foot doctors came over to Uganda, and what they did was they went out into the bush, and these were very, very sorry, I've got that wrong. What they did was they came over and trained 5,000 foot doctors, and they were trained within 3 months, and they were sent into the bush and to the countryside, and they could handle 80% of illnesses. They couldn't handle cancer. They couldn't handle all the things, but they could increase the way that people did things. They did things like, for instance, don't let the dogs that work with the cattle into the village at night because they will defecate and they will use these nets. And they did all sorts of cook well away from where you defecate, where you're using, the latrine.
Yeah.
Keep and they educated people. So it made a very strange thing that when AIDS came along into Africa, if you looked at the AIDS map of Africa, you'd see that Uganda was totally different because people sent out messages, don't have unprotected sex, because there was already a kind of preventative health service already there. Now, I'm quoting other people on this. I'm not an expert in this area. But what it actually does show that you can actually spend money on prevention, and it can have a knock-on effect and reduce the requirements of the problem that you have around the emergency. Now, I believe that one of the big problems, and I've spoken to a lot of people in and around medicine. I've spoken at my local hospital in Cambridge, and I've said to them, probably about 50% of the people that are regularly coming to your hospital are people who come from poverty, who come from need. And they were saying, yes, lots of them have food poverty issues. So actually, if you wanted to have a healthier National Health Service, what you'd do is you would reduce the amount of people who come in with poverty issues. And how would you do that? You would invest and demonstrate by this investment in the prevention of the inheritance of poverty. Most of the people I work with in prisons, 90% of them, come from generations of poverty. Most of the people I work in and around health, most of the people I work in coming out of the care system, most of the people I work with in the streets, they come from the inheritance of poverty. So actually, until we wake up as human beings, which means that Oxbridge and all the other universities in the UK and the Ivy League universities in the United States and the École de Supérieure in France, and I don't know any of the others, until they wake up that we're actually not designing our thinking in a way that is about interventions in prevention. It is still always about but locking the stable door after the horse has run away. These kind of things. And that is why I believe that the biggest problem we have now is the problem of the redesign of thinking.
I think that's quite powerful. And at the same time, for me, it brings me joy to hear someone else talking about this. But at the same time, how much time it needs to happen or pass by to keep to really move from illness or emergency to prevention? Because yeah, I as part of what we're doing as well is we want one of the words that you didn't say it like that, but it's called task sharing, right? Like, how do we bring task sharing into the communities? Which means that in what I do, for example, it's delivering glasses. Instead of the only ophthalmologist and optometrist giving glasses to people, there's a way in which in this, for example, in Kenya, instead of getting reading glasses as we do in the UK or in the US in a pharmacy or in any places that you need reading glasses, you can buy them up front. You need to go to an optometrist and ophthalmologist. And that hampers people to get glasses, because if you go to the rural areas, usually there's not a lot of ophthalmologists and optometrists to giving you glasses. So it's also making this disparity and inequality in poverty. So I resonate with what you say, but at the same time is, how long does it have to pass, or how long do we still need to make this mind shift, because that hasn't happened, and it's quite discouraging, because we're not thinking in prevention. We're thinking in, once the problem is there, then how do we evolve this? At the same time, you mentioned the custodial service and you talk about the prison. So let's shift gears a bit to the custodial sentence. And how we view this in today's society, I would believe is quite divisive, right? Like, it's either sentencing and in prison, but not exactly like, how do we prevent that to happening? If it were invented today, what would it be, in your perspective, that needs to change? Do we have to build it in the same way? What's your take on that? Also, as someone, as you said, you were there before. What would be your take on this?
Well, can I just finish off with the just what I was saying about, you talk about the people needing glasses in areas like in Uganda or in Kenya and all that. We have to do more of that.
Yeah.
The only problem is that there's a scarcity of interest in doing that, because there's a scarcity of money. The money is being spent wrongly. And what we've got to do, in my opinion, is to be so brilliant at emergency, so brilliant that we lift people out. And actually, what is interesting about reading glasses can transform your life, can actually lead to you getting a job, can actually lead to you being educated, can actually lead to you being able to do things like appreciate art and all sorts of stuff like that. And so therefore, we have to try and bring prevention into the emergency. So we need to create, what's a colloid? A colloid is a meeting of oil and water. Oil and water don't mix, but you mix them together and you create something called a colloid. I'm a printer. I'm an ex-printer, and we were always having problems with colloids. But the point is, we have to make the emergency almost beautifully something that can be transformed into a preventative thing. Because what you're trying to do in the emergency is prevent somebody tomorrow, next week, or next year having to have another handout, have another stopgap. And so therefore the science, in my opinion, this is where the redesign the emergency so it becomes sticky, so it becomes something. Somebody gives you a fish, but at the same time is training you. While they're giving you the fish, they're training you how to fish. And that is, in my opinion, where an enormous amount of intellectual energy should go. So in a sense, what you do is you accept the fact that the emergency is with you and you can't run away from it. But it becomes a new form of emergency because it becomes an escape from the emergency. And it also becomes a way of preventing you needing that fish in a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years. So that is where rethinking. Now, I'm one of those persons who said, let's get on and rethink. I don't know how to do it. I'm not I am not. I'm writing a book at the moment called a small book on big thinking. I'm crap at thinking. I'm a real crap thinker, but I'm taking the reader on a journey where they and me discover thinking and how we need to move it on. I don't want to be, and I never could because I never had the education. You know, I didn't have any levels. I didn't do all of that stuff. I became a mature student when I was 40. Uh, uh, but I couldn't read and write until I was 16. So there's no way I'm going to be a philosopher. No way I'm going to be a thinker. So I want to take people on a discovery, a journey, and I want them to see the mistakes I'm making. Let's embrace each other's mistakes so that we can then move on. So I'm trying to redesign thinking. And to me, one of the greatest pieces of glory we could get while we're on Earth is to redesign the emergency. And you, Melissa, have just highlighted one of the most brilliant things. Give somebody a pair of glasses. It's like giving them a pair of shoes so that when they have shoes, they can walk somewhere and maybe get a job or get some kind of income. Give people that, but make sure that you can do it as well as possible so that it's not just another handout. It is a hand up. It has to be a hand up. Anyway,
Exactly.
sorry.
And I think that's great because to that point, it's not a handout. And what we're doing is, as you said, working on the prevention, working with the health system. So then we train community healthcare nurses or workers. So then the business is within them. It's not within us. So we bring the product to them. We train them. They get the business. They get the profits. And they deliver the glasses to the people that they know. But that has had a lot of backlash from different ophthalmologists and optometrists and sometimes ministers because it's the redistribution of power in a way.
Yeah.
And the redistribution of economy. So I think for me, that's what you said is so important. That is, let's not think about the problem when it's happening. Let's think about the solution before the problem even happens. And that is part of the prevention. But there's a lot of different forces that are against that, even though people are thinking about it. And even though you're bringing solutions to that, there's a system, as you said, the box is broken. And that means that there's a distribution with power and distribution of economy.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I mean, it is interesting the vested interests that exist, and they're often the people you would never think, because an ophthalmologist is there presumably to make people who have eyes. I mean, I wear glasses. You know, I'm a very old man. I'm 80. You know, I wear glasses, and the ophthalmologist enables me to do all sorts of things in life which I couldn't have done 100 years ago or 50, 60 years ago when I was, you know, a working class guy. You know, but we have to break those monopolies, and I believe that one of the ways. I mean, we did something very. We got a load of bikes from the police some years ago. I mean, you get these opportunities and then they disappear because the people running the police change their minds or they stop, you know, new people come in. We got a load of bikes from the police that had been removed from areas that they shouldn't have been. You know, they cut the chains, and we put these in a container, and we sent them to Africa. And a bike in Africa can be the difference between feeding your children and not. And that is a prevention thing, and we have to celebrate that. It's not simply giving somebody a bike so that they can be as they were before. You're liberating them, and that to me is why I'm very excited about this idea of turning the emergency into a form of prevention and a form of cure. But if we want to go on about the sentences, I spent last summer or the summer before. I'm a white guy with my family are Irish, so I'm not very good in the sun, you know. So we're one of those people who go red like a lobster. Then the summer's over and you're red. I don't brown very well, and the thing is that I went to Spain the summer last or the summer before. I went white and I came back white, and the reason for that is I spent the week in prisons. I went to see prisons that were young offenders. I'm very, very interested in young offenders because I was a young offender. And while I was in young offenders institutes and on probation from the age of 10, shoplifting, stealing bikes, stealing cars, doing all those kind of things that, you know, petty crime. And I was in and out with these institutions. Every time I got arrested, they taught me something. I learned to read and write in a boys' prison at the age of 16. That system has disappeared in England. Now, most young people like me would spend 20 hours a day in their cells. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. So I went to Spain because there's a charity called Diagrama, and they run most of the custodial systems for badly behaved young people. Some of them very, very badly behaved because they've done murders. Some of them are, you know, just nuisances like I was. But the point is, I went there and I nearly cried. I mean, it was extraordinary because they were doing what they used to do in the UK 50, 60 years ago when I was a child and a young boy and a young man. And it was all about education, social training. It was all about redemption, rehabilitation. And therefore, we have a great need to address ourselves to that. But the other thing is that we have to redesign we have to bring in restorative justice, which is where you put the wrongdoer and the victim's family together in order to humanize both lots of people. That we have to recognize that people do wrong because they've been brought up wrong, because they come from wrong circumstances, because their family are often in poverty, and it's, you know, their lives are devalued. They're coming from behind. The moment they are born, they're coming from behind. They're not starting at the race of life and everything from now on is galloping towards a great future. They're not, they don't even get to the starting line. And these people are the people who cause most of the havoc, cause most of the crime. I mean, not white collar crime. I'm talking about the things that screw up our daily lives in the communities that we live in. We have to reinvent that. The problem is that there is, in my opinion, there are so many good examples. There's places in Missouri in the United States, and there's places in the UK, and there's places in France, and there's places in Norway, and they're all really brilliant best practices. but they don't go mainstream.
Mhm.
So in my opinion, until we create a mainstream situation, then we're having a real problem. I do feel, and I don't want to get too fancifully philosophical, I think one of the problems that we have now is that we, in the UK, and I'm talking exclusively about the UK, but the same could be said for any European country, and certainly for the United States, we have a class divided situation. We have them and us, the insiders and the outsiders. And we have real problems with this. It's coming to bite us. I mean, to a large extent, what's happened in America with Trump. Trump, an unusual person to represent the people who feel completely excluded by liberals' democracy, completely excluded. And this man, this property speculator or whatever he is, comes to represent them. And it's very weird. We're having the same thing in the United Kingdom, where we've got a guy called Nigel Farage, who looks as though he's representing the interests of people who are really cheesed off with the political delivery of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Liberal Democrats. So you've got these people who are just out of society. And in my opinion, it is a class issue. It is an issue of these people who never had their lack of opportunity addressed in the course of the 80 years since the end of the Second World War, when Britain went through the creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service and all that. And it's the same thing's happening in Germany and France and other countries. And they're turning on immigrants because, you've got to find someone to blame. And you've got this kind of rubbish thinking. And I believe that it's because we never addressed those issues of prevention. All we did was just give people, we gave them a handout, not a handout. The House of Lords and the House of Commons is obsessed with making the poor more comfortable. They're not obsessed with getting them out.
So you talk about prevention, and when we're thinking about the custodial sentence, it's quite whether it's about reform or punishment is one of the key questions. And you can see recently in the press there's been divisiveness if it seemed to land too much on one rather than the other. When we're thinking about design, we're sort of framing a problem. And if you think about society and if you think about government, it's quite tricky because who's your customer? It's really, you've got so many different people in there. So if we're thinking about the custodial sentence in particular, and if we're thinking about prevention, that's obviously has very positive benefits to all parts, to those who may end up in the prison service, to those who may be victims of crime, and to society in general. If we're redesigning that sentence, what would it look like? What is the problem we're trying to solve from your perspective?
I think the problem we're trying to solve is what we're trying to is redeem the human part of the human. We're trying to redeem that part that unites you, me, and everybody else in the world.
So if we often talk about stakeholders in that, when you're designing something, you have different groups with different perspective. So is that perspective only the perspective of the perpetrator?
Well, the perpetrator is the most evident sign of a misbehaving society, a society that has got it wrong. Because if the society had got it right in the first instance, they would have designed out the inhumanities that come with poverty. They would have designed out. So my big argument against the welfare state and against the governments, or whether it's Labour or Conservative, is that they've never addressed the inheritors of poverty. They've never addressed those people who are like my own brothers who never got the opportunities I got because they just were manual laborers, and their children and their children's children are people, and probably even another generation. They're people who are stuck. They have no ambition. They don't know about art. They don't know about music. They don't know about good food and all that, because they were excluded after the Second World War when we were going to address poverty. We didn't. We addressed poverty for the low-hanging fruit. We didn't address it to the people whose minds had been screwed by poverty. I mean, I think it's interesting, and I upset people, some people, because I remind people that, you know, I was born into the slums of Notting Hill, where there were broken windows, where we slept on a mattress on the floor. We never had any blankets. We had old coats. We didn't have underwear. We didn't have toothpaste. We didn't have things like that. We didn't drink water. We just drank tea. We had a terrible diet, which would disappear in the week because we'd run out of money. We shared a toilet with 8 other families. There were 30 other people trying to use one toilet. So, you know, you can imagine how difficult that was. We, it was freezing in the winter and boiling in the summer. But what went with that was the mind-forged manacles of poverty. It's the poverty of experience that you live in, but it becomes the poverty of spirit. So what was I? I was brought up as a Catholic boy, go to church. We didn't like black people. We didn't like Indians. We didn't like Jews. We didn't like anybody. We didn't like Arabs. So we were made to think in a quite a horrible sort of way. And we were always people whose minds almost had been designed to fail.
Yeah, that's perfect. And that's and I think you're a really living example of how that's been rethought in time, right? So you've really changed from that lived experience to redesigning and thinking in a completely different way. This is probably a good time to do my 3 takeaways from what I've picked up from the show. But before I do that, is there any single takeaway that you'd want to leave people?
Yeah, well, my what I would like to see, which is the dumbest thing, completely dumb, because I'm not, I'm not overeducated, and my education is, made up on the go. I really would like people to stop and think, why is it that there are so many things that work very beautifully in the world? And why is it that there are so many things that work wrong? And to me, it is a design issue. Why is it that you have children in schools in the United Kingdom and probably in other countries who are suffering from the fact that they go to school at 4 or 5 and they're wearing nappies because there's a breakdown of the family. There's a breakdown of, so, and they can't speak properly. There's an increasing problem with how do we tackle poverty, and that means kind of redesigning the way that we intervene in the lives of the poorest amongst us. And often that looks paternalistic, that looks overbearing, that looks as though the state is involving, when really everybody wants to say, oh, the state is a bad thing. It's the state has a role to play.
Yeah.
But it has to be, you have to redesign, in my opinion, you have to redesign the thinking of the people who are making decisions. And the people who are making decisions are largely the middle classes, and they're running the world. And until the middle classes kind of wake up to the fact that their thinking doesn't equate with what is needed now, then I think we're lost. So that's why at the Royal College of Art, I said I would redesign thinking.
Yeah.
And my book, a small book on big thinking, is about trying to take that argument somewhere.
Yeah. No, that's great, John. We're both ex-Royal College of Art in different ways. So I was the head of product design and head of also global innovation design, where we met Melissa, who was a student at the time between Imperial and Royal College of Art. So we're quite familiar with this. So with the three takeaways, I think for me, there's one really big one, which we've talked about, which is the shift to the left to prevention. And I think the thing that you've added to that discussion is to do the emergency, the here and now, very beautifully. I also think you've discussed about humanizing people with lived experience of homelessness. And I think that bit is really important. And I think actually it links with the prevention and the focus on here and now. Now, being in a university and having worked with a lot of people across the medical field, I do think there's a huge amount of thinking and prevention from all the way up from the chief deputy medical officers. That's my experience from working with 3 of the NHS trusts across the southwest of England, through down to the doctors, down to the nurses, down to the people with lived experience. I think everybody's on board. And I think there's other barriers, and it's partly related to the budgets, organization, and systems. And I think what you've said about focusing and doing the emergency here and now beautifully, that's the missing bit in that piece. And there's something else there. The here and now is what is visible, right? So in hospitals, often the challenge of dealing with the prevention, they're not your patient. They're not there in front of you. The moment they're there in front of you, they are living people with stories. They've got a name, they've got a family, they've got friends, they've got hobbies. They're not just a number and a statistic. So it's quite easy for us as human beings to focus on what we can see and not focus on what we can't see. But there's other barriers in there. So I think that focus on how we can learn to deal with the emergency beautifully is really something new to that thinking that's very, very important in there. And the second bit, the examples that you gave with both you, Melissa, and John gave, of giving objects which enable a lot more than what the functionality of that object is. So a bike, for example, that you gave the example in Kenya, and your glasses. And it's thinking globally, that's true. We've seen examples around the UK where it's also true. That, there's Ealing Council, Essex councils have given bikes out to help people improve their mental health, or to help families to support children with obesity. So the function of these objects, which are not obvious, can really be transformative in there. I think the other thing that we're seeing globally, so in design education and in other educations, so Exeter's pretty strong on climate science, but what we're seeing there is systems thinking, or a systems approach beginning to be thought about in all sorts of fields. So not just in design, in climate science, in all sorts of other topics. And I think there is probably going to be a new generation, which is, so it's more positive look of graduates and people coming out who do have that broader perspective and can see things not just in that solving the problem of here and now in there. So those are the 3 takeaways that I have on there. And just to say thank you very much, Johnny, for joining us.
Could I make just one point? If you could do something that, if I would love my legacy to be that we did not see the poor as another species.
Yeah.
I think that is one of our problems. We are rescuers, and we go to rescue people who are in poverty or in need and all that. And I think if we began to see them as us in embryo or in reconstituted, so that they could bring change in their lives. I meet so many people who've had reversals of fortune in their early lives, terrible things. and they've got out of it. And I would like us to just not accept any one human being in this world as being of a, needing us. If they need us, we have to help them to get away from that need. And in a way, we have to end up needing them.
Yep.
Because they will have developed something that we need. So you have to kind of not allow us to say it's a them and us. And I think that's the great problem. And that's where the class system comes in.
I think in
Because it makes
design,
us-
that concept
Yeah.
has been there in terms of co-design. We call it often co-design or bringing stakeholders. But this is why when I asked about the homelessness question, that's very challenging to do. So in healthcare, the idea of bringing patient or carers with lived experience is really firmly in place, especially in UK. Right? There's very rarely that you would design a service without consultation with a number of people with lived experience. All research in healthcare that's funded through a particular healthcare body will always have conversations and be shaped or and listen to people with lived experience. That hasn't become embryonic in other areas. And that is what you're saying. And it's sometimes harder to do in other areas because we can say, oh, we'll design a little workshop. But actually, how are we doing a workshop with people living on the streets? It's not so easy to do it. There are examples. I've heard from actually a professor in Cambridge University in computer science, where they've looked at homelessness and been really adapted to follow through. But the perspective of making people human and not seeing them and us, I think that is something that is actually central to design. But design is not always central to the design of these systems. And that's where we're a little bit far apart.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this. I think I'm running out of battery.
No, that's
not me.
Not me, your phone.
Right. So we're very excited in the next episode to bring Nicola Goga, who's the head of design at the Ministry of Justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think, or if you have an idea for a future guest or topic at www.decodedpodcast.com.
Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you listen, and follow us on TikTok and Instagram at decoded.podcast. See you!